A birthday party. The kind of night meant for joy, for laughter that echoes across porches and fields, for music carried on the autumn air. In the small community of Fort Hall, Idaho, it should have been nothing more than friends gathering, glasses raised, voices lifted in celebration. But beneath the hum of chatter and the clink of bottles, tension simmered, invisible to first, like a storm forming far beyond the horizon. Then, without warning, it cracked open. Gunfire shattered the night. Startled laughter died in throats. The sound of music was swallowed by panic. And on the grass outside, under the dull glow of a porch light, blood pooled dark and heavy into the soil. The kind of sight that leaves an imprint on anyone who dares look long enough. Somewhere in that chaos, a body was carried away. A man, gone in an instant, his absence concealed in the back of a truck that rolled into the night like a shadow refusing to be caught. When the truck returned, the question was no longer whether a man had died, but where his body would be buried, and whether anyone would ever speak of it again. And then came the words, cold, ordinary, delivered as though they carried no weight at all. A request for a shovel. How does a celebration end in murder? How does a human life vanish in the middle of neighbors and kin with witnesses standing just feet away? And how could it take 4 long years before the missing man's remains were finally uncovered, returned to his family only after silence had settled heavy across the community? This is the story of a night that began with laughter, ended in violence, and left Fort Hall carrying questions it could not shake. And so it begins. He rose with the slow, stubborn calm of a man who had learned to move around grief and responsibility like furniture in a crowded room. Mornings for him were not sudden awakenings, but patient rituals. A kettle that whispered on the stove, the scrape of a chair across creaky floorboards, the soft thump of a single boot against wooden steps. At 44, his face carried lines that belonged to weather and work more than to time. Small, map-like creases around his mouth, a pale scar along one knuckle that told of a life spent repairing what others discarded. His hands were the story he could not hide, calloused, stained, precise in a way that made neighbors hand him their broken things without thinking twice. He moved through the reservation with familiar gestures. People nodded as he passed. Children reached for the back of his jeans when he crouched to tie a shoe. He kept a thermos in the truck and a photograph folded into the wallet he rarely opened in public. He knew the names of everyone who sold fry bread at the powwow and could hum the melody that the elders sang at evening gatherings, a tune that threaded the long house to the laundromat to the corner store. He showed up when someone needed a ride to an appointment, when an elder's roof needed patching, when a neighbor's sputtering engine refused to turn over. Small kindnesses stacked until they became the weight of a life. There was work, and there was a way he worked. He fixed motors and mended fences, coaxed machines back to life with patient adjustments and a half-spoken apology to metal. When he wasn't with his hands, he was with his mouth, telling stories in a hushed cadence, trading memories of the river and of winters when the snow came early and stayed late. He loved the texture of a story, the particular warmth of a joke that could only land in a certain kitchen, among certain faces. He disliked busybodies and sudden changes in plan. He disliked being rushed. He kept his hair cropped close, his jacket patched at the elbow, and a library of small superstitions tucked into the pockets where he kept spare screws and a cheap lighter. Family framed him. He was not merely someone who belonged to a place. He belonged to a web. Siblings who called on Sundays, cousins who dropped by with jars of preserves, a mother who treasured a gift he once made with his bare hands.
He sat with the elders during council meetings more by instinct than by obligation, listening longer than speaking, keeping the tender balance of respect and plainness that elders taught. He had a nephew who followed him around like a shadow, learning the language of bolts and the rhythm of fixing things. He kept promises, small, unspectacular promises that accumulate into trust. There were private corners of his life that no one else polished. He would sit alone on the back steps and smoke until his fingers glimmered faintly in the dusk, thinking in patient circles about debts and favors and the neat, stubborn arithmetic of daily life. He did not speak of every scrape or every temper flare. He owned the fact that his tongue could be blunt, that temper, when it arrived, came like a sudden gust that startled even him. He paid for mistakes in quiet ways. A repaired door here, a favor returned there. He had regrets, but he also had a stubborn kindness that kept him tethered to people who needed him most. The small objects that followed him around became anchors in memory. A dented kettle he refused to replace, the same faded cap with a frayed brim, a battered pickup whose muffler rattled like a low laugh. There was a photograph, edges worn soft, tucked into the wallet beside a receipt for a gas stop, and a note written in a hurried hand. He kept a worn pocket knife in the same place, useful for cutting rope, for whittling a toy, for opening mail when the fingers were numb. These things told the story of a life lived in particulars, not in headlines. In the community, he was both ordinary and irreplaceable. People relied on him for the kind of labor that required patience, for the voice that could steady an angry conversation, for the presence that smoothed rough days. There were those who saw him as a man of habit, steady and predictable. Others remembered the afternoons when he surprised them with a laugh so sudden it broke whatever tension had pooled in the room. He had friends who drank too much and friends who clung to tradition. He moved between them with a kind of quiet diplomacy, stepping into the space where people needed a hand or an ear. He loved ritual in small ways, the way the coffee tasted stronger after a snowfall, the careful tying of ceremonial ribbons before a gathering, the solitary practice of humming an old song while he sharpened a blade. He took part in dances and listened to elders tell stories of those who came before. There was a reverence in how he treated the past, neither a show of piety nor a refusal of sorrow, but a steady acknowledgement that life carried both grief and resilience in equal measure. And yet, there were moments of restlessness, private flickers that suggested he carried burdens not meant to be set down easily. Bills accumulated in mismatched envelopes. Arguments lingered longer than apologies. He sometimes arrived late at gatherings, catching the end of a conversation, and leaving with a thoughtful look, as if cataloging slights and favors in equal measure. He had friends who drank too much and friends who clung to tradition. He moved between them with a kind of quiet diplomacy, stepping into the space where people needed a hand or an ear. He loved ritual in small ways, the way the coffee tasted stronger after a snowfall, the careful tying of ceremonial ribbons before a gathering, the solitary practice of humming an old song while he sharpened a blade. He took part in dances and listened to elders tell stories of those who came before. There was a reverence in how he treated the past, neither a show of piety nor a refusal of sorrow, but a steady acknowledgement that life carried both grief and resilience in equal measure. And yet, there were moments of restlessness, private flickers that suggested he carried burdens not meant to be set down easily. Bills accumulated in mismatched envelopes. Arguments lingered longer than apologies. He sometimes arrived late at gatherings, catching the end of a conversation, and leaving with a thoughtful look, as if cataloging slights and favors in equal measure. He had friends who drank too much and friends who clung to tradition. He moved between them with a kind of quiet diplomacy, stepping into the space where people needed a hand or an ear. He walked out into the evening the same way he had moved through his life, practical, necessary, almost casual in his motions. Beyond his doorstep, the town kept its rhythms, waiting to be seen.
Fort Hall, in the autumn of 2014, was a place suspended between two worlds. The nights carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, the kind that turned breath into pale mist and made footsteps crunch against the dry carpet of fallen leaves. By day, sunlight revealed wide stretches of land where the earth itself seemed to remember every story ever told upon it. By night, the reservation turned quieter, softer. Yet in that silence, every sound seemed sharper. A dog barking down the road, the rustle of a cottonwood tree, the distant hum of a passing truck. The reservation was more than a scattering of houses across the Idaho plains. It was a living community, held together by bonds of family, tradition, and shared history. At gatherings, the smell of wood smoke clung to coats and hair, mingling with the aroma of fry bread and coffee poured into mismatched mugs. Elders told stories that reached back generations, their voices low and steady, while children darted through the yards, their laughter cutting through the chill air. Life here was stitched together from these small, ordinary rhythms. Morning visits to neighbors, evenings spent at tribal events, whispers that spread faster than the wind. Everyone knew each other's habits, each other's victories, each other's struggles. And in such a place, secrets were not supposed to survive. But survival came in unexpected ways. Beneath the warmth of tradition, beneath the sense of kinship that drew families together around kitchen tables and fire circles, there were fractures. Poverty lingered at the edges. Addiction cast its shadow, and old grudges often lay dormant until the right spark set them ablaze. In Fort Hall, joy and struggle lived side by side, never quite separating, always threatening to blur into one another. The season only amplified it. Autumn brought beauty, the golden sweep of the fields, the fading light sinking early behind the mountains. But it also carried an unmistakable loneliness. Nights were long, and in that long darkness, stories could twist, memories could fade, and truths could be buried. And while most nights ended as they began, quietly, with porch lights blinking out one by one, there were some when the air seemed charged, as if waiting for something to break. Fort Hall was a place where voices carried, where gossip traveled faster than cars on the open road. Yet somehow, when one secret finally came to life, it would leave the entire community stunned at just how long the silence had lasted. And it was within this world, both tight-knit and fragile, that one October night would unravel everything.
The night of October 2014 should have been nothing more than a birthday gathering. A small house lit against the cool dark of Fort Hall, music spilling from cracked windows, the sharp scent of beer carried on the breeze. Laughter drifted through the autumn air, mixing with the crackle of conversation and the uneven rhythm of boots shuffling across the yard. It was Ish's birthday. And like so many nights before, friends and family came together, voices rising, bottles clinking, the reservation's silence momentarily replaced by celebration. But even within the warmth of company, tension moved quietly through the air, almost invisible. Witnesses later recalled an argument between Ish and Ook. What caused it? No one could say with certainty. Perhaps it was the alcohol loosening tempers. Perhaps an old grudge that had never fully been buried. Perhaps nothing more than a careless word that cut too deeply in the wrong moment. Whatever its spark, the disagreement grew sharp enough that people noticed. Some glanced away, hoping it would pass. Others leaned in, uneasy, sensing a storm just beneath the laughter. Then came the sound no one expected. Gunfire cracked through the night. The music died in an instant, replaced by the shrill sound of panic, chairs scraping, feet pounding the earth, voices breaking into shouts as people scattered into the shadows. Where moments before there had been dancing and laughter, there was now only chaos and fear. On the ground, blood spread across the grass in a dark, glistening pool beneath the harsh glow of a porch light. Shell casings caught the light, scattered like grim reminders of what had just taken place. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy, biting the air, clinging to every breath. Some tried not to look, others couldn't turn away. Ish's uncle, standing on the edge of it all, saw what others missed, the lifeless body being lifted, carried not with reverence, but with a desperate urgency, into the bed of a pickup truck. The truck rolled into the darkness, its tail lights shrinking against the black horizon, carrying away both the man and the terrible truth of what had just occurred. The party was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the music had ever been. When Ish returned later, his presence carried not the joy of a birthday night, but something colder. He asked for a shovel. And with that single request, the night of laughter transformed into a mystery that would shadow Fort Hall for years.
When the first patrol cars arrived that night, their headlights swept across a yard that still bore the marks of celebration. Folding chairs lay overturned in the grass, beer cans glinted faintly in the dirt, and a half-empty bottle sat abandoned on the porch rail, as if the partygoers had vanished mid-toast. But the true focus of the officers' flashlights was darker, wide, uneven patches of blood staining the earth. Shell casings gleamed where they had fallen, mute evidence of the violence that had shattered the night. Yet there was no body, no victim, only the silence of a place that hours earlier had pulsed with music and laughter. For Ock's family, the absence was unbearable. They had no body to mourn, no place to lay flowers, no certainty about his final moments. Was he alive, hurt somewhere, calling for help? Or had he been taken, discarded like he was nothing? Each unanswered question clawed deeper at their hearts. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers stood at their doors, scanning the night with unease. Every hour that passed without word became heavier, like a stone pressing down on the community. The search began quickly, though it carried a sense of confusion. Officers walked the perimeter, tracing the footprints stamped into the dirt, noting the marks of tires that had spun off into the night. Searchlights swept over fields, their beams cutting across the reservation's dark expanse, yet finding nothing but the rustle of dry grass. In homes nearby, curtains shifted as neighbors peered out, whispering about what they had heard, what they had seen, and what they dared not admit aloud. Some swore they had caught the sound of more shots than anyone reported. Others claimed to have seen the truck leaving in haste, but their words faltered when asked for details. Fear tightened lips. On the reservation, silence was often born not just of loyalty, but of survival. Who wanted to risk speaking too loudly when no one knew who might be listening? Still, not everyone stayed quiet. A local reporter arrived within hours, her notebook in hand, chasing leads with a determination that set her apart. She pressed the police for answers, published every detail she could scrape together, and reminded the public that a man was missing, not just a name in a report. Her words carried into kitchens and cafes, fueling discussions that spread like wildfire. A neighbor, older and known for her sharp eyes, confided quietly to friends that she had heard voices after the gunfire, urgent, panicked voices, followed by the heavy thud of something being moved. Yet when asked by investigators, her recollection blurred, as if the fear of being wrong, or being right, froze her memory.
In the days that followed, Ock's family refused to let his name fade. A close family friend began organizing vigils, small gatherings where candles were lit and prayers were spoken under the open night sky. The flames flickered against the autumn wind, their glow reflected in the wet eyes of relatives and neighbors who stood together, shivering not just from the cold, but from the weight of the unknown. Whispers spread through Fort Hall like wildfire. Some accused the police of dragging their feet, of failing to secure leads before they went cold. Others wondered if the truth was deliberately being hidden. And beneath it all, one question echoed in every home. If this could happen to Ock, who would be next? The community's curiosity curdled into fear, a collective unease that settled over the reservation like a heavy fog. And as days stretched without answers, the lines between silence, suspicion, and dread blurred, leaving behind a town caught between loyalty and terror. From that silence, the investigation would begin to take shape.
The investigation unfolded in fragments, like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. In the first days, law enforcement moved quickly, not with certainty, but with urgency. The whispers, the frantic testimonies, the blood on the ground, all pointed in one direction. Ish was arrested, charged not yet with murder, but with assault with a deadly weapon. It was a step forward, though far from resolution. Inside the sterile rooms of the sheriff's office, the tension was heavy. Witnesses, shaken from the chaos of that night, began to talk. Slowly, reluctantly, and often contradicting one another. But out of the haze, a clearer picture emerged. 4 separate voices, unconnected yet consistent, spoke of the same chilling sight. Ish raising a gun, the shots that cracked through the autumn air, and Ook collapsing in the grass. The memory of that image seemed to stain them, as if the flash of gunfire had burned itself permanently into their minds. One testimony stood above the rest. His uncle's account carried a weight no one could ignore. He described what others had not dared, seeing the body, lifeless, loaded into a pickup truck, a scene that turned rumor into reality. It was this detail that made silence impossible to maintain. For the investigators, it became the thread to pull on, the testimony that transformed speculation into accusation. Yet even with words stacking against him, one problem lingered. There was no body. Without it, prosecutors faced an uphill climb. Could they truly prove murder when the most crucial evidence, a life taken, a body concealed, remained hidden? That absence gnawed at detectives. Every search, every sweep of fields and barns ended in frustration. They had testimony, yes, but the earth itself refused to yield the proof they needed. And then came the distractions, the stories that muddied already troubled waters. Some swore Ish had not acted alone, that others had helped him spirit the body away under cover of darkness. Rumors of a larger cover-up spread through the community. Names whispered in corners, fingers pointed at shadows. Was it family, friends, or a network of silence rooted deeper than anyone dared to admit? The speculation consumed time, resources, and trust, leaving investigators wondering whether they were chasing justice or chasing ghosts. The deeper the case stretched, the more it revealed the fragility of truth in a community bound by fear. People hesitated before speaking, second-guessed themselves, and weighed the cost of their words. Some seemed almost paralyzed, as if giving testimony could make them targets too. And so the investigators faced their greatest challenge not just in finding evidence, but in piercing through a silence cultivated by fear and self-preservation. Would you have trusted the witnesses to speak their full truth? Or would you have stayed quiet, hoping the storm passed without pulling you under? That question loomed not only for the community, but for the jurors, the prosecutors, and every person drawn into the orbit of this case. The investigation pressed forward, thin threads pulled into knots of testimony, but always circling back to the same haunting absence. No body, no grave, just the memory of a man and the blood that marked his final moments. That absence would define the years to come.
The years that followed became their own kind of prison, a slow and relentless sentence carried out in silence. In 2015, the charges against Ish shifted. What began as assault became second-degree murder. It was a legal escalation that carried weight, yet still no one could point to the most essential truth. Where was Ok? A man's life had ended. Witnesses swore to it, but his body remained lost to the earth, and without it, his absence became both undeniable and strangely intangible. By 2017, the case reached the courtroom. The trial became a stage for memory, where witnesses retold what they had seen, voices trembling as they described gunshots cracking through the night. The jury listened, the community leaned in, but even as words painted vivid pictures of violence, there remained an empty space, a silence that no testimony could fill. Without a body, the crime felt suspended, floating between certainty and doubt. The verdict carried justice on paper, but for the family, it left a hole untouched by law. Outside the courts, the years rolled on with a brutal kind of consistency. Each October, the calendar returned to the date of his disappearance, and with it came vigils, prayers, and the ache of anniversaries. Families gathered around tables where one chair always stood empty, untouched, a silent reminder of the man who should have been there. In photographs, his face grew older only in memory, while in reality, his absence remained fixed in time. The community of Fort Hall carried the story like a scar. Posters that once hung bright and urgent grew weathered, edges curling, colors fading under rain and wind. At the gas station, at the grocery store, in whispered conversations that died the moment strangers approached, his name surfaced again and again. Children who had been too young to understand in 2014 grew up hearing his story as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly violence could shatter the fabric of a close-knit community. For the family, time did not soften grief, it sharpened it. Mothers aged beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Siblings carried guilt over things unsaid. And nights were haunted by the same unbearable thought. Was he buried close or carried far away? Did the earth itself keep the secret, or had someone else ensured it could never be known? Rumors fed that torment. Sightings were whispered. Someone thought they saw him walking along a distant road. Another swore they caught a glimpse in a nearby town. Each tip brought a flicker of hope, only to collapse into despair. Theories circulated endlessly: shallow graves in fields, riverbeds hiding bones, mountains swallowing evidence. None of it proved true. Each dead end left the family more hollow, yet more desperate, trapped in a cycle of hope and devastation. And through it all, obsession crept into quiet corners of the community. For some, it became impossible to drive past the stretch of road near Ish's home without scanning the fields. Others turned over stories in their minds, piecing together what might have been, unwilling to let the case rest even when exhaustion begged them to. Everyone in Fort Hall knew the story, but no one could escape it. The years passed, but the question never changed. Where was Ok? And in that question, the cold case lingered, waiting for the day the silence would finally break.
Autumn in Fort Hall carries its own rhythm. The fields turn brittle and golden, the mornings arrive wrapped in mist, and the air itself smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. It was in this season, after 4 long years of silence, that the ground finally gave up its secret. Human remains were discovered. The news swept across the reservation like a sudden wind, stirring up memories many had tried to bury, reopening wounds that had never healed. After endless searches, whispered theories, and years of aching uncertainty, here at last was something tangible. Fragile bones pulled from the soil, waiting to speak. For the investigators, the discovery was a turning point. For the family, it was a storm. The phone call came first, delivered in the kind of clipped, careful tone reserved for tragedies that cannot be softened. Then came the knock at the door, that moment when officials arrived in person, hats pulled low, eyes heavy with the weight of what they carried. Behind the door, a mother's hands trembled before she even heard the words. She knew. Somehow, she had always known. But hearing it aloud cracked something inside her that had been straining for years. Imagine the silence in that living room as the truth settled. The tick of a clock suddenly too loud. A candle on the table burning low, its wax dripping onto the wood. And in the center of it all, the realization that hope had finally run out. Relief collided with devastation. At last, there would be no more wondering if he was cold, if he was lost, if he might one day walk back through the door. At last, there were answers, but the answers came dressed in grief. The following year, the wait ended with confirmation. In 2019, testing identified the remains beyond all doubt. It was Ok. His name was no longer tethered to the word missing. Instead, it was anchored to the finality of death. For the family, the confirmation brought an unbearable clarity. They clutched photographs, pressed worn shirts to their faces, and wept not for the uncertainty, but for the certainty that had taken its place. Closure, people call it. But in reality, closure is jagged, cruel. It is the relief of knowing entwined with the torment of finality. It is the end of a question, but not the end of grief. The family gathered together in prayer, voices breaking as they remembered his laughter, his habits, the way he filled a room. There was gratitude that he had been found, but every smile was edged with sorrow, every sigh weighted with the knowledge of what could never be restored. The discovery of his remains did not erase the years of pain. Instead, it gave them shape, an ending that no one wanted, but everyone had to accept. And with that acceptance came a new chapter in the story, one that would force the community to confront the truth that had been buried all along. When the remains were identified, the weight of truth pressed down not only on the grieving family, but on the community as a whole. For years there had been whispers, testimonies, rumors of violence, but without a body, doubt lingered. Now the earth itself had confirmed what so many had feared. The discovery breathed new life into old words, validating witnesses who had taken the risk to speak and shattering those who had clung to denial. At the center of it all was Ish. He was no longer a figure of speculation, no longer a shadow moving through rumor. He was a convicted man, and the body's recovery sealed the cracks that skepticism had left open. But to understand the gravity of that moment, one has to step back and look at who Ish was to the people around him. He wasn't an outsider drifting into their world. He was part of it. He was someone who had sat at family barbecues, someone who had shared beers on porches as the sun went down, someone whose laughter once echoed across the same streets where fear now lingered. That is what made the betrayal so bitter. The monster wasn't a stranger. It was someone familiar,
Someone who carried trust in his pocket like loose change and spent it freely until it was gone. His history, when examined closely, read like a slow-burning fuse. Friends spoke of a temper that flared without warning, of nights clouded by alcohol, of a man who could switch from charm to menace in a breath. It was not one eruption that defined him, but a pattern, one too often ignored until it was too late. Was this killing something he had planned, a calculation born in silence? Or was it a flash of rage, a storm that broke suddenly and destroyed everything in its path? The line between the two is narrow, and in Ish's case, blurred by his own demons. Psychologists would later suggest that such violence rarely comes from a single spark. It grows in layers: resentment, pride, fear of losing face. Perhaps it was about control, perhaps about humiliation, perhaps simply about power. But beneath all those theories lies a haunting truth. What drove him to take a life was not extraordinary. It was all too human, all too common, and that is what makes it terrifying. For the community, the arrest carried no triumph. It carried a sickness. The man they had trusted to share meals, to stand in photographs, to be part of their ordinary lives, had become the embodiment of their nightmares. At the gas station, people shook their heads. At the grocery store, whispers lingered in the aisles. Children, once told not to fear the dark, now grew up hearing that sometimes the danger lived right next door. In the end, Ish's conviction and the discovery of Auk's remains were not just the closing of a legal chapter. They were the tearing away of innocence in a place that had once felt safe. The betrayal came not from outside, but from within. And as the town absorbed this truth, another question remained. How does a community learn to trust again after discovering the face of the monster was one they already knew? It was a question that would linger, even as the courtroom prepared for its final reckoning.
The courthouse in 2017 stood like a solemn stage, its walls heavy with the weight of expectation. On winter mornings, frost clung to its windows, and the air outside carried that sharp bite that makes every breath feel colder, harsher. Inside, though, the chill came from something else. The tension of a community gathered to see whether justice would finally speak. The trial of Ish was not just another case. It was the unraveling of years of whispers, accusations, and fear, all funneled into the silence of a courtroom where every creak of a chair, every shuffle of paper carried the echo of lives forever altered. Witnesses took the stand one by one, their voices steady at times, breaking at others. 4 of them relived the night with eyes that refused to meet Ish's gaze. They described what they had seen, what they had heard, as if carrying the burden of memory was almost too much to bear. Every detail cost them something. Every pause, every stutter, every tear. The defense pushed back, trying to weave doubt into their words, but the collective weight of their testimony pressed down like a storm cloud, refusing to break. Would you have found the courage to speak if the danger still lingered just beyond the courthouse doors? In the gallery, Auk's family sat shoulder to shoulder, bound by grief and determination. Sleepless nights had carved deep lines into their faces. They listened as lawyers dissected their loved one's final hours with clinical detachment, as if he were a puzzle to be solved, rather than a son, a brother, a friend. And then came their turn. Impact statements that filled the room with raw pain. Mothers spoke of empty chairs at dinner tables. Siblings spoke of laughter stolen too soon. And fathers struggled to keep their voices from collapsing under the weight of loss. Some jurors wiped their eyes discreetly, but all of them listened, the humanity of the case cutting through the legal language that usually cloaked such proceedings.
And then there was Ish. He sat expressionless, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward, his silence as loud as any testimony. Was he defiant or simply detached? No one could say for certain. But his presence in that room, flesh and blood, breathing, stood in cruel contrast to the absence of the man whose name filled every page of the trial. The prosecution laid out its case piece by piece. The witnesses, the blood evidence, the violent history that painted Ish as a man quick to anger and slow to regret. The defense countered with shadows and speculation, no body, no definitive proof of death. Yet the jury listened closely, weighing the bravery of witnesses against the silence of the accused, the pain of the family against the uncertainty of absence. And when the verdict finally came, the air in the courtroom seemed to hold still. Ish was convicted of second-degree murder and assault. For a moment, relief rippled through the family, a sense that the system had heard their cries. But peace did not come. How could it? There was still no body, no grave to visit, no place to lay flowers and whisper final goodbyes. Justice had been delivered in fragments, like a story told with missing pages. The gavel fell, but closure remained just out of reach. And as the courthouse emptied, the community walked back into the cold, carrying with them both the satisfaction of a conviction and the ache of unfinished truth. The judgment had spoken, but the story was far from over.
In the summer of 2019, when Auk's remains were finally returned to his people, the community gathered in solemn unity. The air carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass, smoke rising into the open sky as tribal elders led the blessing and cleansing ceremony. Candles flickered in the dusk, their small flames trembling in the breeze, while voices lifted in prayer and song. Ancient rhythms passed down through generations, now offered in grief and remembrance. The circle was one of both mourning and healing, a way of honoring a life cut short and restoring balance after years of silence. For the family, it was not the closure they had dreamed of, but it was a chance to lay him to rest within the traditions that had always guided them. Grief was etched deep into their expressions, but so too was resilience. Mothers held on to children tighter, fathers stood with hands pressed against hearts, and siblings wept openly, their tears falling into the earth that now received him. Tradition became both shield and balm, a reminder that while violence had taken Auk, it could not strip away the sacredness of who he was, or the love that bound him to the people who gathered in his name. Yet the legacy of his death stretched far beyond the ceremony grounds. The Fort Hall community was left to confront an unbearable truth, that the violence had not come from an outsider, but from one of their own. How does a town recover when trust is fractured at its very core? Neighbors once bound by friendship now carried the uneasy knowledge that betrayal had grown from within their circle. The laughter of community gatherings was quieter, the conversations edged with caution, and the weight of "what if" seemed to hang in every silence. The case forced broader conversations about violence, about accountability, about the justice system's ability to hear native voices that are too often overlooked. For some, it became a call to protect the next generation, to ensure that anger, alcohol, and unspoken grudges would not erupt again into tragedy. For others, it was a reminder of how fragile life can be, how easily trust can be broken, and how long healing can take when wounds run deep. The story of Auk's life and death became part of the fabric of Fort Hall. His absence was felt at family dinners, at birthdays, at the everyday moments that should have carried joy, but instead carried a shadow. Yet his memory also became a source of strength, a reason for his loved ones to speak his name, to light candles in his honor, and to remind the world that his life had mattered.
And so the question lingers, sharp and unsettling. If it could happen here, at a birthday party among friends, could it happen anywhere? This was more than a case. It was a warning, a mirror, and a call to never turn away from the truths that hide in plain sight.